It's Christmas, thought Joachim when he woke on Little Christmas Eve. He was itching to open the last door but one in the magic advent calendar, but he didn't dare touch it until Mama and Papa were up. Before long, both of them were awake. Papa had taken a day off work. "Because it's Christmas," he said again. Joachim opened the last door but one in the advent calendar. It was a picture of a man walking beside an ass. On the ass sat a woman in red clothes. A piece of paper had fallen out of the calendar. Papa unfolded it and read what was written on it. Joachim could see his hand was shaking. A godly company was on its way to Bethlehem. In a way, the procession of pilgrims stretched from the long, narrow countries below the cold North Pole at the top of Europe right down to warm Judea, which is where Europe, Asia and Africa meet. It stretched from the distant future right back to the beginning of our era. There were 7 godly sheep, 4 shepherds, 3 kings of Orient, 5 angels of the Lord, the Emperor Augustus, the Governor Quirinius, the innkeeper, and Elizabeth, who was allowed to sit on the back of an ass on the last part of the journey to the city of David. They moved along more and more slowly until they were going at an ordinary walking pace. Ethereal said that the angel watch had stopped at the year 0. He pointed to a city far away and said that was Bethlehem. At once the Emperor Augustus halted and put his sceptre into the ground under an olive tree. He stood up straight and opened the book he had been carrying under his arm and said in a commanding voice, "The time has come." They all remained standing on the road, and the Emperor continued, "I order you all to write your names in the census." He held up a piece of charcoal and handed it to each one of the pilgrims in turn. Then they all wrote their names in the big book, even the angels. Only the sheep were excused, probably because they couldn't write and nobody had given them names. Elizabeth was last to write her name. She read out all the other names before she added her own signature. First shepherd Joshua, second shepherd Jacob, third shepherd Isaac, fourth shepherd Daniel. First wise man Caspar, second wise man Balthazar, third wise man Melchior. First angel Ethereal, second angel Imperial, third angel Seraphiel, fourth angel Cherubiel, fifth angel Evangeliel, Quirinius, governor of Syria, Augustus, emperor of the Roman Empire, innkeeper. Elizabeth added her name in this way: first pilgrim, Elizabeth. Then she had a good idea. She thought the sheep ought to be included in the census, even though they couldn't write and hadn't been given any names, so she wrote first sheep, second sheep, third sheep, fourth sheep, fifth sheep, sixth sheep, seventh sheep. She glanced up at the Emperor Augustus. She was afraid he might be angry because she had messed up his census, but he merely slammed the book shut. Elizabeth had worked out that there were 23 pilgrims listed in the census if she included herself in the 7 sheep. That was as many as a whole class in school. After they had registered, the pilgrims became a little more solemn, as they had been in Scania and Hamelin, in Venice and Constantinople, in Myra and Damascus. Ethereal said, Joseph went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. The procession of pilgrims started moving off slowly, but before long Ethereal said that they had to stop again. He pointed down the road. A young man was walking beside an ass, and on the ass sat a woman in red clothes. In the background, Bethlehem was spread out over a terraced landscape with long slopes almost bare of grass because of all the flocks of sheep. "There are Mary and Joseph," said Ethereal, "for now the time has come, like a ripening fruit." "I must hurry to get there before them," said the innkeeper, and he started running across the hills. As he ran, he muttered to himself, "No, I'm sorry we're full up, but you can stay in the stable." A certain nervousness transmitted itself to the other pilgrims. It was as if all of them were rehearsing something they had to know by heart. Imperial leapt into the air, beat his wings and said, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be for all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger." Ethereal nodded, and Imperial exclaimed, "Wonderful!" Then the angel Evangelial blew his trumpet, and all 5 angels chorused together, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." The sheep suddenly began bleating. It was as if they too had started practicing something they had to learn by heart. Joshua the shepherd turned to the other shepherds. "Let us now go even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which is come to pass, which the Lord hath made known unto us." And finally, the wise men spoke. "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him." They knelt down and held out the caskets with gold, incense, and myrrh. The angel Ethereal nodded with pleasure. "I think that'll do." Joshua laid down his shepherd's crook carefully on the fleece of one of the sheep and whispered, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." Papa sat for a long time with the piece of paper in his lap before anyone dared to say anything. He had read that a certain nervousness had spread among the pilgrims as they came closer to the stable in Bethlehem. The same thing happened in Joachim's little room too. "There can only be one Advent calendar like this in the whole world," said Papa, "and we're the only people to have been given it." Mama nodded. "And the real Christmas night happened only once, but that Christmas night resulted in Christmas all over the world." "That's because the glory of heaven spread so easily," said Joachim. "I think it must be infectious." There was still a lot to do before Christmas Eve. The family tradition was that Mama and Papa decorated the Christmas tree on the evening of Little Christmas Eve, after Joachim had gone to bed. But this year they decided they would all 3 do it before John came. Then everything would be ready for Christmas. Afternoon came. Mama set the table and put out all the good things they had to eat, including the big macaron cake. The clock was striking 7 when the doorbell rang. "You open it, Joachim," said Mama. "You were given the magic Advent calendar, and he invited himself to you for coffee." He ran to the door. The old flower seller was standing on the steps outside, smiling broadly. He held a large bouquet of roses. "Please come in," said Joachim. Then Mama and Papa came, and John gave Mama the roses. "Thank you very much," she said, "and thank you for the wonderful Advent calendar." John put his hand on Joachim's head and replied modestly, "I think perhaps I ought to thank you." When they were seated, John took a sip of coffee and then began to tell them about himself. "I was born in Damascus and grew up in a Christian home. Some people think our family goes back to the first congregation in Syria. One day, when I was a boy, I found an old jar containing scrolls of manuscript that were almost torn to shreds. My parents had the good sense to take it to the museum. They were discovered that the jar was very old, and so were the scrolls. What was written on the scrolls? Asked Papa. They were various reports from Roman legionaries. Among other things, they reported something that had happened in Damascus at the end of the 2nd century after Christ. In the year 175, a curious procession is supposed to have come rushing out through the eastern city gate. A few years later, a similar procession came rushing into the city through the western gate. It was reported that some were angels in both processions. Mama and Joachim nodded, for they remembered what they had read in the Magic Advent calendar. There are many legends and myths like that from times gone by, continued John, but I was surprised that the procession should have run out of the city before it ran into the city. If it had, it would have had to run backwards in time. And that's quite impossible, of course. Yes, quite impossible, agreed Papa. He made a sign that John should continue. But my interest in myths and legends had been aroused. I began to read old books and was particularly interested in stories about people who thought they had seen angels. Finally, I had a valuable collection of such stories from my own part of the world and from many countries in Europe. After some years, I went to Rome to take advantage of the treasures in the libraries there. And that's where you met Elizabeth? Asked Joachim. John nodded. But wait a bit. I had paid attention to only a few of the angel stories because I thought they had something in common. They were from widely differing places, such as Hanover and Copenhagen, Basel and Venice, the Val d'Aosta in northern Italy, and the Axius Valley in Macedonia. But they were from different periods too. The earliest story was from Capernaum in Galilee, and the latest was from Norway. That happened on a country road outside Halden as recently as 1916. The vintage car, said Joachim. Of course, there are very few people who believe such stories these days. All the stories I had collected said that the sight of the little girl and the angel had lasted only a second or two. But when I compared the stories from Halden, Hanover and Hamelin with the stories from Aosta, Axius and Capernaum, well, those stories became quite remarkable. The flower seller sat for a while, lost in his own thoughts. Something that is mysterious for 1 second is often quenched like an empty oil lamp in the next, he said. Yet, if we only turn our heads in another direction, a new light may be lighted there. For we cannot take in what is sacred in the same way as we pick up a stone from the ground and put it in our pockets. Angels float down unseen. They don't fall into the middle of the market square. What happened to the young woman in the photo? Asked Papa. John sighed. Joachim thought he saw a tear in the corner of his eye. At any rate, he put his hand up there. Once, he said, many, many years ago, I met a young woman in Rome. It was a meeting which lasted only a few weeks, but I became very fond of her. Tell us, said Papa, tell us about it. She called herself Tebasil and was very secretive. She said she was probably born in Norway, but she had grown up among the shepherds and sheep farmers in Palestine. The latter was certainly correct, for she spoke fluent Arabic. And the name Tebasil sounded fairly Palestinian, although it could easily have been Italian as well. But it's Elizabeth backwards, exclaimed Joachim. John nodded. Yes, you're a sharp one, you are. People don't usually spell their names backwards. Go on, begged Papa. It might have been true that she was Norwegian as well. Her skin was fair, almost peach-coloured, and her eyes were blue and sparkling. When I asked what took her to Palestine, she sat just staring into my eyes. She said, I was kidnapped. I had to ask who had kidnapped her, and she replied, an angel who needed me in Bethlehem. But it's so long ago. I was only a little girl. Mama gasped. What did you say? Asked Papa. Other people would probably merely have smiled at such a pack of lies. But I thought of all my angel stories. I replied that I believed what she told me, but the very fact that I took her seriously must have scared her. What happened next? Asked Mama. We saw each other only once after that. It was on the way of reconciliation in front of St. Peter's Square. She said she would be leaving Rome the same afternoon, but she let me take a picture of her. That was in April 1961. How did you come to Norway? Asked Papa. And why? John took the top ring of the macaron cake and said, I came here because I hoped to meet that mysterious woman again, and since then I've stayed here. But I've never met her. I've never managed to find her. I've never managed to find the answer to where she might be. But we'll see. He took a bite of the little macaron ring. It wasn't long before I heard about the disappearance in 1948. That was when I began asking myself whether the poor little girl could have been Deborah Seal, who had said she'd been kidnapped by an angel when she was a small child. I didn't know exactly how old she was, but it could fit if she had been born in about 1940. John was silent for a while. Then he said, I noticed the strange similarity in the names only recently. It's a fact that we often repeat the names of people we think about in our minds. One day, we suddenly read it backwards. During the early years in Norway, I thought about Tebasil almost continually. Then it struck me like a bolt from the blue. When I read her name backwards, it turned into Elizabeth. I became even more convinced that I really had met the missing Elizabeth all those years ago in Rome. That was when I began to make the magic advent calendar. I was many months making it, you understand. In any case, it was an incredible coincidence, commented Papa. I had to ask myself whether she could really be the one and the same person, said John. After all, it was curious that the one name turned into the other backwards. This must have happened just after I met Anna, Elizabeth's younger sister. It had struck me that Anna was an amusing name that was exactly the same whichever way you read it, from front to back or back to front. Maybe that was why I suddenly spelled Elizabeth backwards. Besides, I thought Elizabeth's little sister was very similar to Tebasil. Why did you make the advent calendar? Asked Mama. Why didn't you write it all down in a book? John laughed. You think anyone would have believed me in that book? You think any publisher would have published it? Mama shook her head, and John said I made the magic advent calendar so that at least one person could carry the story of Elizabeth and the long pilgrimage further. In that way, I hoped the old mystery might one day be solved. After all, I don't know how much time I have left, but now I'm no longer the only person who knows this strange story. Then you put a picture of Elizabeth in the shop window, said Mama. John nodded, to see whether anyone here would recognise her. Why did you travel to the wilderness? Joachim wanted to know. And the old flower seller explained. Every Advent, I go out to the country and walk in the woods and the hills outside the town to find peace before the Christmas festival, but also to see whether I can find any trace of the lamb, Elizabeth, and the angel Ethereal who set off for Bethlehem in 1948. I admit it. Sometimes I walk about saying the two names inside my head. Elizabeth. Tebasil. Elizabeth. Have you never wanted to go back to Damascus asked Papa. John shook his head. No, this is my home now. I sell flowers at the market, and in that way I can help spread a little of the glory of heaven around me. That sort of thing is very easily scattered, you know. And one day Elizabeth may come back to town, because there's something else. It was so quiet in the room, they could almost hear dust falling on the wooden floor. John said to Joachim, all these years I've tried hard to find her again, but I only knew her first name, or so I believed. To find an Elizabeth or Tebasil only by her Christian name, whether in Rome or in Palestine, well, that's more difficult than to catch a sparrow in your hand. I've been laughed at in embassies and in census offices in quite a few countries, but Joachim... Again, it was completely silent in the room. Joachim may have helped me to find her again, so I'm the one to thank you. Joachim looked up at Mama and Papa. He couldn't fathom what John was talking about. I think you'll have to explain it a bit more, said Mama. It was Joachim who set me to thinking that maybe she had both names. One is her first name and the other is her last name. It's strange how lacking in imagination we can be when we're thinking the same thoughts year after year. Joachim's face lit up. Elizabeth Tebasil, he said. Is that what she's called? There's a telephone subscriber in Rome who has that name, but it's not Christmas yet. Tomorrow you must open the last door in the magic advent calendar. John got to his feet and said he had to hurry because there was something he had to do. But maybe I can have a look at the advent calendar for one last time, he said. Joachim rushed into his bedroom and took the magic calendar down from its hook. When he went back into the sitting room, he handed the calendar to John, who stood examining the picture. You must push all the open doors shut, explained Joachim. So that's what he did. He said, yes, here they all are, Quirinius and the Emperor Augustus, the angels in the sky, the shepherds in the field, the kings of the Orient, and Mary and Joseph and the Christ child. But not Elizabeth, said Joachim. No, not Elizabeth. They accompanied John to the door. As he was about to leave, he said, so we'll have to see what this Christmas will bring. Indeed we shall, said Papa. He was clearly relieved to have finally heard the flower teller's story. But John said something more. You won't open the last door in the advent calendar until the bells ring Christmas in tomorrow afternoon, will you? Mama looked at him. No, I suppose not. No, we'll have to try to wait that long, decided Papa. When John was on the steps outside, he said, maybe I'll knock on your door tomorrow as well. Joachim was delighted. He felt something bubbling and fizzing deep down inside him. That was because John had said that maybe he'd look in tomorrow too. For Joachim was not as pleased about everything as Mama and Papa were. Something was still missing, it seemed to him.